we're going to break down a pretty interesting and definitely politically charged report that just came out. It's from the Democrats on the Joint Economic Committee, and it makes some really bold claims when it compares how the economy is done under presidents from both parties. So let's walk through their numbers and see exactly what they're arguing.
And they do not bury the lead. Right out of the gate, this is the central argument of the entire report. Quote, "The U.S. economy has performed much better under Democratic presidents than Republican presidents in the modern era." Now, that is a huge statement, so let's dig into how they actually try to back that up.
The committee basically builds its entire case around what it calls an economic through line. We're going to follow that line and look at the exact data points they use to support this idea, and we're going to start with something everybody understands, the job market.
So how does the report build this case? Well, its first big pillar is the American workforce, looking at two key things: jobs created and the unemployment rate. Okay, the first major piece of evidence they present is this massive number, 50 million. According to their analysis, that's the total number of jobs created under the last 3 Democratic presidents. That's Clinton, Obama, and Biden.
And then, right after that, they immediately show you the other side of the coin. Over that same time frame, they calculate that 17 million jobs were created under the 4 Republican presidents. So based on their numbers, we're talking about a nearly 3-to-1 difference. The report then kind of zooms in on the direction unemployment is heading, and it uses the last 2 presidents as a key example. It points out that under President Biden, the rate fell pretty significantly, from 6.4% down to 4.1%. But in contrast, it notes that during President Trump's term, which of course included the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, the rate actually went up from 4.7% to 6.4%. The report argues this isn't a one-off, but part of a larger pattern.
Okay, so jobs are one thing, but what about the overall health and, the growth of the economy? That brings us to the next section, which is all about GDP, the state of manufacturing, and this recent boom in new startups.
When you look at real GDP, which is a really important way to measure economic output, the report calculates 10% growth under the current administration, and it notes that this is just a little bit ahead of the 9% growth that was seen during the previous one.
Now, this is interesting. The report then shifts its focus to a really specific area, manufacturing. And its analysis points to a pretty clear trend. It shows manufacturing jobs have generally gone up under recent Democratic presidents, while making the claim that they've actually gone down under all recent Republican presidents.
And to really drive that point home, the report gives us some very specific and pretty stark numbers from the last 2 administrations. It says that under President Trump, there was a net loss of 178,000 manufacturing jobs. And then it contrasts that with a net gain of 729,000 jobs in that same sector so far under President Biden. So you might be wondering, why the recent turnaround? Well, the report has an answer for that. It directly credits laws like the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act, arguing that these policies are what sparked this surge in manufacturing investment, pushing it to the highest level ever recorded. And it's not just about big factories. The report also highlights what it calls a boom in entrepreneurship. We're talking a record 19 million new business applications filed under the Biden-Harris administration. And it says this isn't just happening in a few places, it's a trend across all 50 states, with small businesses being the engine for over 70% of all jobs created since 2019.
All right, let's get to the final metrics the report uses. And honestly, this is where it draws its sharpest contrasts. We're talking about the national debt and the history of economic recessions.
So when it comes to the national debt, the committee makes this really stark claim that twice as much debt was added under President Trump as under President Biden. The report mostly pins this difference on the 2017 tax cuts, while also acknowledging the necessary pandemic spending that happened under both administrations.
Okay, before we get to the report's final and maybe its biggest statistic, let's just make sure we're on the same page. The report is looking at all 11 recessions, those significant downturns in the economy, that have happened in what we call the modern era, so since the end of World War II.
And here it is. This is probably the most eye-popping statistic in the whole report. Of those 11 recessions that have happened since World War II, the report concludes that 10 of them, that's 91%, all began while a Republican president was in the White House. So we've walked through all this data, the jobs, the GDP, the recessions. What is the ultimate takeaway from this report? Let's just quickly recap the main points from their analysis. So, in a nutshell, the JEC Democrats report is arguing that the data shows this really clear pattern. They're saying there's significantly more job creation, faster economic and manufacturing growth, and less debt added when Democrats are in charge. And then there's that bombshell claim that nearly all modern recessions kicked off under Republican leadership.
So, the numbers laid out in this report certainly point to a pretty clear correlation. But that, of course, raises a much, much bigger question that economists and, well, all of us are constantly debating. How much of this is just correlation and how much is actually causation? Or to put it another way, how much direct control does any single president really have over an incredibly complex global economy? And that's the big thought we'll leave you with.